Senator, I'm not your sweetheart. I'm a congresswoman who was elected to represent 760,000 constituents. The entire Senate committee room went silent. What happened next turned Lindsey Graham's condescending smile into a national embarrassment and made Jasmine Crockett an overnight political legend. In just 3 devastating minutes, the Texas congresswoman systematically dismantled the 69-year-old senator with such surgical precision that even his Republican colleagues were left shaking their heads in disbelief. If you've ever been talked down to by someone who assumed their age or position made them untouchable, smash that like button and subscribe right now, because what you're about to witness is the most satisfying takedown in congressional history. A masterclass in how preparation and competence can absolutely destroy arrogance and entitlement when the cameras are rolling. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on voting rights legislation was supposed to be just another day of political theater in Washington. Room 216 in the Hart Senate office building had seen thousands of these performances before. Republicans defending election integrity, Democrats warning about voter suppression, nothing changing, and America moving on to the next manufactured controversy. The committee room was packed with the usual suspects: lobbyists, activists, journalists, and C-SPAN cameras capturing everything for posterity. At the head of the committee table sat Lindsey Graham, the 69-year-old South Carolina senator who'd spent over 2 decades in Congress, perfecting the art of saying a lot while meaning very little. Graham had mastered the Washington game of survival, switching positions when politically convenient, making grand pronouncements that led nowhere, and treating politics like a performance designed to generate cable news clips rather than actual solutions. His specialty? Making young progressives look emotional and unreasonable while he appeared to be the voice of measured experience. Graham had been riding high lately, positioning himself as Donald Trump's most loyal defender, despite once calling him a race-baiting, xenophobic religious bigot. His chameleon-like approach to politics had made him incredibly effective at maintaining power while accomplishing very little of substance. But his success had bred a dangerous arrogance, particularly when dealing with younger politicians and women. He'd perfected a condescending style that mixed Southern charm with barely concealed contempt for anyone who challenged his authority. Across the room sat Jasmine Crockett, representing everything that terrified the old Washington establishment. At 43, the former civil rights attorney had only been in Congress since 2023, but she'd already established herself as someone who refused to play by the traditional rules of political deference. Crockett's path to Congress had been shaped by years of fighting for people who'd been dismissed, ignored, and marginalized by exactly the kind of institutional power that Graham represented. As a lawyer in Texas, she'd represented workers who'd been cheated by their employers, families who'd been discriminated against by banks and landlords, and communities that had been systematically excluded from economic and political power. Her approach to politics was fundamentally different from Graham's performative style. While he specialized in saying nothing while sounding important, Crockett focused on specific policy solutions backed by detailed research and real-world experience. If you're enjoying this breakdown of Washington power dynamics, hit that like button right now. It helps more people see this video and understand how our political system really works. The issue that brought these two political forces into direct collision was voting rights, specifically federal legislation designed to protect access to the ballot box in states like Texas and South Carolina, where Republican legislatures had passed increasingly restrictive election laws. For Graham, this was an opportunity to defend states' rights while positioning Democrats as federal overreach extremists. For Crockett, it was about protecting the fundamental democratic rights of her constituents. But beneath the policy disagreement lay a much deeper conflict about power, respect, and who gets to speak with authority in American politics. Graham represented the old system where seniority, connections, and political survival skills mattered more than expertise or commitment to principles. Crockett embodied a new generation of leaders who believed that competence, preparation, and moral clarity should matter more than how long someone had been warming a seat in Washington. When Crockett's turn finally came to present her testimony, she delivered a methodical presentation about how voting restrictions disproportionately affected working families, elderly voters, and minority communities. Her examples were specific and well-documented, Her policy recommendations detailed and practical, her delivery professional and authoritative. But as she spoke, Graham's body language began to change. He started checking his phone more frequently, whispered comments to his staff that made them chuckle quietly, and looked around the room with the expression of someone enduring a particularly boring lecture. When Crockett finished her presentation, Graham leaned into his microphone with the confident smile of someone who was about to educate a child about how the world really works. "Well, that was very interesting, Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make it clear he found nothing interesting about anything she'd said. "I appreciate your passion for these issues. Really, I do. It's refreshing to see young people who care so much about civic participation." The room got noticeably quieter. Other committee members looked up from their phones and documents. Graham's tone suggested this was going to be more than routine questioning. This was going to be a teaching moment where the experienced senator showed a freshman representative how politics actually worked. "But I have to ask," Graham continued, leaning back in his chair with visible amusement, "do you really think that everything you've described is as simple as you're making it sound? Because those of us who've been doing this for a while understand that election law is incredibly complex, and there are always two sides to every story." It was classic Graham. Dismiss the substance of her arguments by suggesting she was too inexperienced to understand complexity, then position himself as the voice of mature wisdom. He wasn't actually addressing any of her specific points, just implying that her youth and inexperience made her perspective invalid. Crockett's response was measured and professional. "Senator Graham, I appreciate your concern about complexity, but the examples I've shared aren't theoretical. These are documented cases of voters in my district who've been disenfranchised by laws that serve no legitimate purpose except to reduce turnout." "Oh, I'm sure you believe that," Graham replied, his smile getting wider and more condescending. "But sweetheart, the Constitution gives states the right to manage their own elections. That's not voter suppression, that's federalism. Maybe when you've been here a little longer, you'll understand how our system actually works." The word "sweetheart" hung in the air like a slap. The entire room tensed as everyone processed what had just happened. In 2024, a senior senator had just called a sitting congresswoman "sweetheart" on live television, while dismissing her expertise and suggesting she was too naive to understand the Constitution. If you've ever been in a situation where someone with power tried to diminish you with a patronizing nickname, drop a comment below. We want to hear your story. Crockett's eyes flashed dangerously, but her voice remained calm. "Senator, I'm not your sweetheart. I'm a congresswoman who was elected to represent 760,000 constituents, and I'd appreciate being addressed with the same respect you show your male colleagues." Graham waved his hand dismissively, apparently oblivious to how badly he had just stepped in it. Of course, I didn't mean any disrespect. It's just that, when you've been in the Senate as long as I have, you learn to see the bigger picture. These voting issues you're talking about, they're not as black and white as you're making them seem." He was doubling down instead of backing off, apparently believing that his seniority and Southern charm would protect him from any consequences for his patronizing behavior. But the room was getting tenser by the minute as other committee members realized they were watching a senior senator systematically disrespect a colleague on national television. "Let me give you some friendly advice," Graham continued, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher explaining something to a slow student. "If you want to be effective in Congress, you need to learn how to work within the system instead of coming in here with these idealistic proposals that have no chance of passing. That's just not how Washington works." Crockett sat perfectly still, letting Graham dig his hole deeper with every word. She'd seen this pattern before. Older white men who assumed that their position entitled them to lecture younger women about subjects they'd studied far more thoroughly than their supposed teachers. "I understand you want to make a difference," Graham said, his condescension now so obvious that even some Republican committee members were looking uncomfortable. "But real change takes time, and it requires understanding how to build coalitions and make compromises. You can't just come in here demanding everything you want and expect people to take you seriously." The irony was staggering. Graham, who'd spent his entire career flip-flopping on every major issue for political convenience, was lecturing Crockett about understanding how to make real change. But he was so convinced of his own superiority that he couldn't see how ridiculous he sounded. As Graham continued his patronizing lecture about political reality and the importance of learning how Washington worked, he made one final mistake that would define both their careers forever. Looking directly at Crockett with the kind of smile that men like him had been using to dismiss women for generations, he delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times across social media. "Look, young lady, I know you mean well, but maybe you should spend less time grandstanding for the cameras and more time learning how things actually get done around here." The moment those words left his mouth, everyone in the room knew that Lindsey Graham had just made the worst mistake of his political career, because Jasmine Crockett was about to show him exactly how things get done by someone who came prepared for battle. The silence that followed Graham's young lady comment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in that committee room. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, as all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to being publicly disrespected by a colleague old enough to be her father. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm, the kind of controlled fury that prosecutors use when they're about to destroy a witness who's just lied under oath. "Senator Graham," she began, each word precisely delivered and crystal clear through the microphone system, "I want to make sure I understand what just happened here. You called me sweetheart, then young lady, while dismissing my constitutional expertise and suggesting I don't understand how government works. Is that an accurate summary of your position?" Graham realized immediately that he was in trouble, but his decades of political survival instincts kicked in. He tried to deflect with humor and false humility. "Now, Congresswoman, I was just trying to offer some friendly guidance based on my experience." "Stop!" Crockett's voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked if I accurately summarize your position. Do you believe that calling me sweetheart and young lady while questioning my competence is appropriate behavior for a United States Senator?" The trap was set perfectly. Graham could either admit he'd been inappropriate or double down and look even worse. Every camera in the room was focused on his increasingly uncomfortable face. "I meant no disrespect," he said weakly, his usual confidence completely gone. "You meant no disrespect?" Crockett's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Senator, you just spent 5 minutes treating me like a naive child who wandered into the wrong room instead of a sitting member of Congress with a law degree and 12 years of civil rights experience. If that wasn't disrespect, what would you call it?" But Crockett was just getting started. She stood up slowly from her chair, and somehow her 5'4" frame seemed to tower over the entire committee room. "Since you seem so concerned about my understanding of how Washington works, Senator Graham, let me share some insights about how things actually get done around here," she continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with every word. She pulled out a folder, the move that anyone who'd seen her previous confrontations would recognize as a very bad sign for her opponent. "Let's start with your advice about learning how to work within the system," Crockett said, opening the folder with surgical precision. "This is your voting record on civil rights issues over the past decade. You voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act 3 times. You opposed the Freedom to Vote Act. You blocked the For the People Act. So when you talk about working within the system, you mean working to maintain a system that disenfranchises my constituents." Graham's face was getting redder by the minute. He tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished, Senator. You wanted to educate me about political reality, so let me return the favor. If you're enjoying this masterclass in preparation defeating arrogance, hit that subscribe button right now. We break down political confrontations like this every week," she continued, pulling out another document. "You mentioned federalism and states' rights. This is a list of federal programs that have provided over $15 billion to South Carolina during your time in the Senate. Federal disaster relief, federal highway funding, federal agricultural subsidies. Apparently, federalism doesn't apply when your state needs money." The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of reporters frantically typing notes on their phones. This wasn't normal congressional discourse. This was a systematic demolition of a senior senator's credibility on live television. "But let's talk about your real expertise, Senator Graham. Political survival, Crockett said, her voice taking on a tone of moral authority that filled the entire room. In 2016, you called Donald Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic religious bigot. Those are your words, not mine. But the moment he won the presidency, you became his most loyal defender. Is that the kind of principled leadership you think I should learn from? Graham looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His usual smooth confidence had been completely replaced by visible discomfort and barely controlled anger. And since you're so concerned about my qualifications to discuss voting rights, Crockett continued, pulling out yet another document, let me remind you of my actual background. I have a law degree from the University of Houston. I spent 12 years as a civil rights attorney fighting the exact voter suppression cases we're discussing today. I've argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. I've represented plaintiffs in landmark voting rights cases. She paused to let that sink in, her eyes never leaving Graham's increasingly flustered face. Your legal background, Senator, consists of a law degree you received in 1981 and a brief career as a military prosecutor before you became a career politician. So when you lecture me about understanding constitutional law and voting rights, you're essentially admitting that you think 40 years of political deal-making makes you more qualified than someone who's actually practiced civil rights law in federal court. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how to systematically destroy someone who'd made the mistake of underestimating their opponent. But Crockett saved her most devastating attack for last. You want to know what I've learned about how Washington really works, Senator Graham? She asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but still audible throughout the room. I've learned that too many people in this city think that longevity equals competence, that being here a long time matters more than being right, that calling someone sweetheart is an acceptable substitute for engaging with their arguments. She looked directly at him with an expression that should have warned him what was coming next. I've learned that some senators think they can dismiss a black woman with patronizing nicknames and condescending lectures instead of actually addressing the substance of voter suppression in their own states. She continued, her voice rising with righteous anger. And I've learned that when those senators get called out for their behavior, they hide behind fake politeness and false courtesy instead of taking responsibility for their actions. The room erupted in scattered applause that quickly built into sustained clapping. Democratic committee members were on their feet. Even some Republican staffers were nodding approvingly at the force and precision of Crockett's response. Graham sat in stunned silence, his face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long career, he was genuinely speechless. The man who always had a comeback, who could spin any criticism into an attack on his opponents, had been so thoroughly dismantled that he couldn't even form a coherent response. So no, Senator Graham, I won't be taking advice about how Washington works from someone who spent 40 years perfecting the art of saying nothing while standing for even less, Crockett concluded, sitting back down with the satisfied expression of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. And I certainly won't be lectured about constitutional law by someone who thinks sweetheart is an appropriate way to address a colleague. The committee room remained in stunned silence for several long moments before Chairman Grassley called for a recess. As members began filing out of the room, Graham remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, while Crockett calmly gathered her papers. But the real explosion was just beginning. Within minutes, clips of the entire exchange were already spreading across social media faster than any congressional hearing content in recent memory. America was about to witness what happened when institutional arrogance met moral authority, backed by meticulous preparation and perfect timing. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished dismantling Lindsey Graham's condescending lecture, phones across America erupted with notifications. Within 20 minutes of the exchange ending, Lindsey Graham's sweetheart was trending nationally, and the video clips were spreading faster than any congressional hearing content in political history. The social media explosion was immediate and overwhelming. The complete exchange from Graham's initial sweetheart comment to Crockett's devastating takedown was posted to Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube within minutes of happening. The response was unlike anything political observers had seen. transcending typical partisan lines as Americans from across the political spectrum united in their disgust at Graham's behavior. Lindsey Graham really called her sweetheart, then got absolutely destroyed, tweeted Political Watch, garnering over 300,000 retweets within hours. This is what happens when an old boys club dinosaur meets someone who actually knows what they're talking about, posted Voting Rights Matter. Graham thought he could mansplain the Constitution to a civil rights attorney. Big mistake, wrote a progressive voice, sharing a compilation of Crockett's most devastating moments. But the response wasn't limited to typical political Twitter. The clips were being shared by celebrities, athletes, activists, and millions of ordinary Americans who'd never posted about politics before. The moment had tapped into something deeper than partisan disagreement. It had captured decades of frustration with condescending politicians who treated serious issues like opportunities for performance art. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Graham's behavior. While they disagreed with Crockett's policy positions, many acknowledged that her response had been both justified and devastating. "I disagree with everything she stands for politically, but Graham walked into that one," admitted Conservative Dad 2024. "You can't call a congresswoman sweetheart and expect to maintain credibility. Whether you like her or not, Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to respond to disrespect with facts and dignity," posted Independent Voter. Major news networks immediately recognized this as a significant story that extended far beyond typical congressional theater. CNN led their evening coverage with senators' condescending comments backfire spectacularly, the Chiron read. Graham calls Congresswoman sweetheart, gets demolished with facts. MSNBC declared it a watershed moment in congressional respect and immediately booked Crockett for primetime interviews. Even Fox News couldn't ignore the story, though they struggled to find an angle that didn't make Graham look terrible. Their coverage focused on heated exchanges disrupting Senate business, while carefully avoiding detailed analysis of what Graham had actually said. Political analysts across the spectrum were struggling to remember the last time a senior senator had so completely humiliated himself in a public forum. Congressional hearings usually featured predictable partisan disagreements that quickly disappeared from public attention. But Crockett had turned routine political theater into a viral moment that was reshaping national conversations about respect, competence, and power dynamics in American politics. What we witnessed today wasn't just political theater, explained CNN's senior congressional correspondent during their evening analysis. This was a complete breakdown of the institutional norms that usually protect senior members from the consequences of inappropriate behavior. Graham made the mistake of treating a highly qualified colleague like a child, and she responded by exposing every weakness in his political persona. Lindsey Graham's response to his public humiliation followed a predictable pattern of damage control that only made things worse. His initial instinct was to double down on his position while claiming he'd been misunderstood or taken out of context. Within 2 hours of the hearing ending, Graham posted on Twitter, "I've always treated my colleagues with respect regardless of party affiliation. It's unfortunate that some people choose to turn routine congressional discourse into viral moments instead of focusing on the serious issues facing our nation." The response was immediate and brutal. Thousands of replies included clips of him calling Crockett sweetheart and young lady, asking how exactly that constituted respectful treatment. Others shared examples of his flip-flopping on major issues, questioning his complaints about people not focusing on serious policy. "Sir, she literally focused on serious issues while you focused on patronizing her," replied Willie Policy Wonk, sharing the clip of Crockett's detailed voting rights presentation. His follow-up tweets made things exponentially worse. "I've been working on constitutional issues since before some of my colleagues were born. Experience matters in these complex debates," he posted, apparently oblivious to how this reinforced exactly the kind of ageist and sexist dismissiveness that had gotten him in trouble. "Senator, she has more recent constitutional law experience than you do. She's actually practiced civil rights law while you've been a politician," responded Legal, along with a side-by-side comparison of their legal backgrounds. By the end of the week, Graham had posted 14 tweets trying to explain away his behavior, each one generating more mockery and more shares of the original confrontation clips. His staff eventually convinced him to stop posting about the incident entirely, but the damage was irreversible. The political implications extended far beyond one senator's embarrassing moment. Democratic strategists immediately recognized that Crockett had demonstrated a new template for challenging institutional disrespect, responding with overwhelming competence and moral authority rather than just expressing outrage. "This is exactly what we need more of," explained a senior Democratic operative. "Too often our politicians respond to disrespect with hurt feelings or procedural complaints." Crockett showed how to turn someone's prejudice into their own political destruction. More importantly, the confrontation had shifted national conversations about women in politics, generational change in leadership, and the difference between experience and competence. Crockett's systematic demolition of Graham's arguments had proven that longevity in office didn't automatically translate to expertise or effectiveness. What happened in that Senate committee room wasn't just about one condescending comment or one brilliant response. It was about the collision of two different visions of American democracy, one that values institutional power and seniority above all else, and another that demands competence, preparation, and moral clarity from our leaders. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument that day. She demonstrated a new model for holding power accountable. She showed that when someone tries to dismiss you based on their assumptions about your age, gender, or experience, the most devastating response isn't outrage. It's overwhelming preparation and irrefutable facts. The lesson for all of us is crystal clear. Respect isn't automatically earned through seniority or position. It's earned through competence, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when facing someone who thinks their status makes them untouchable. What do you think about Jasmine Crockett's response to Lindsey Graham's disrespectful comments? Have you ever had to deal with someone who tried to dismiss you based on assumptions about your age, gender, or experience? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more moments when politicians learn that treating their colleagues with disrespect comes with serious consequences. Because if this story proves anything, it's that in today's America, competence and preparation will always triumph over condescension and institutional arrogance, especially when the whole country is watching.